Across the Spiderverse is setting everyone's brains on fire, and fuck you guys because I haven't been able to see it yet. I'm kidding, I'm so happy for you. So in the meantime, to quench my Spiderverse thirst and that of anyone else who hasn't been able to see Across the Spiderverse yet, I decided to start a Spiderverse series where I examine the visual treatment and animation of the Spiderverse films, and obviously I had to start with the first one, which is Into the Spiderverse, and is still chef's kiss. So in Into the Spider-Verse, we have our hero, Miles Morales, living in Brooklyn, and it all looks pretty straightforward at first. The look and feel is very stylized. It's an extremely unique visual language, particularly in film, because it's 3D, but it draws so strongly from 2D comic books, something we hadn't seen before, at least not like this, until Into the Spider-Verse came out. They used several totally new rendering styles and incorporated hand-drawn 2D effects into the mix as well, for a visual treatment that looked like something brought to life straight out of a comic book. Everything is detailed, yet simplified. If you look at it as a whole, there's a lot going on, but when you really examine each shape or object by itself, you'll see that it's been heavily simplified to give more of an impression of the object, rather than an actual highly detailed or realistic version of it. Like, check out over here, these bricks on this wall. Barefaced brick like this usually has a lot of texture and fine detail in it, but they've really simplified the variations in tones and combined the variations into blocks of color. And then when you have the Ben-Day dots on top of that, your mind thinks there's a lot of detail, but it's basically just filling in what you expect to be there because the surface is busy, but it's actually just the suggestion of detail. It strikes the perfect balance between a realistic yet cartoony look. The visuals make use of really graphic shapes, strong composition in every shot. I mean, you could pause it at any time and have an image you could print out and hang on the wall. Each shot stands so strongly by itself, and saturated colors. Instead of soft gradations between tones and in lighting and shadows, it's bolder, making use of half-toning and line hatching to get that progression in lighting. I love how in the environment designs, they've also included some line work elements, like here in this view of the city where he's doing this awesome freefall, and you can see this brighter line work just offset from the edges of the buildings. It's a really cool little detail. So Miles seems to be your run-of-the-mill teenager in a world that's pretty mundane looking. We have the comic book treatment, with half-tone overlays and Ben-Day dots in the shadows and highlights, the hatching details and moments of chromatic aberration and the CMYK offset you get in misprints of comics. But on the whole, the color palette we start out with is pretty average and realistic, you know, there's nothing really too out there or fantastical. And the text boxes and other more blatant comic book effects only come later after he's been bitten. And this serves to drive home the fact that at the start of the film, Miles is just a normal teenager, grounded in reality, with nothing crazy happening in his life. And this treatment is a distinct contrast to what happens to him later in the film, when the graphic treatment also changes to signify that development in Miles's life and reality. Once he's been bitten by the spider, we immediately start to see the more unusual or extraordinary effects start to appear, like the multi-panel comic moments, text boxes, and 2D elements like his Spidey sense appearing as these squiggles, the sound effects written out in this comic style, graphical, crazy colored backgrounds, and this all serves to signify that shift in his reality. Some of the most notable new effects that were literally groundbreaking in this film were the animated line work on the 3D characters and the way they incorporated 2D and 2.5D effects into the 3D scenes by either having 2D elements literally in the 3D scenes, making them 2.5D, or expertly compositing 2D effects over the 3D renders. The line work on the characters' faces really helped to drive the emotional performances home. They had a really interesting approach to these lines, and the artists could draw the lines onto the characters' faces just like an illustrator, and then the drawn-on lines were converted to geometry in 3D and rigged so that they could be animated. For lines that would move in a predictable way, lines that wouldn't require extreme changes and the attention of manual keyframing from an animator, like on the ears and the nose, they actually used machine learning to automate the animation of those lines. Insane. The animation is mostly done on 2s, which further enhances the feeling of watching the pages of a comic book come to life. Usually, 3D animated films are animated solely on 1s, which means that there are 24 individual frames or images making up 1 second of film. To animate on 2s means that there are only 12 images instead of 24, which are held for 2 frames each, making up 1 second of film. So we get an animation that is less fluid than what we usually see in 3D animation, and it adds to that feeling of watching still images from a comic book being brought to life, because we're seeing each image for 2 frames instead of 1. They did make use of frame rate modulation, which means that for certain scenes like the action-packed ones or where they really want to emphasize speed or get a smooth animation, they would use 1s and then shift back into using 2s in other parts. To keep with the graphic style of the treatment and avoid any softness or blurring that would detract from that harder lined, more defined comic book vibe, they avoided using blurring like motion blur or depth of field. You'll notice that in areas where one would traditionally use blurs, like a depth of field on the background in this scene, they've rather utilized an effect that mimics the misprints you often get in comics when the colors aren't printed exactly on top of one another. So there's a slight offset between colors, which gives the impression of blur without any actual blurriness. And because they couldn't use motion blur, they used other techniques like smear frames and 2D speed lines, and even in some cases, echoing the character. Like over here where Spider-Man is fighting the Green Goblin and he's repeated to give the impression of speed. Color, as in any film, has huge importance in setting the tones of scenes and letting us know more about what the characters are feeling and what to expect without blatantly spelling it out. The scene here with Kingpin, with everything so blue, gives us a feeling of foreboding and dread. And here in this scene with his dad, blue is again used to signify the negativity of Miles' emotions and his mindset at this moment. He feels really alone and overwhelmed. He just saw Spider-Man die and he's carrying this huge burden and he's feeling really lost right now. His dad enters and this warm light spills in from beyond the doorway, bringing in the possibility of comfort and safety that his dad represents. And he runs up and hugs his dad just to get some of that warmth and that feeling of protection in his dad's arms. We're reminded that he is just a kid and he's just gone through something really traumatic and had this huge responsibility just thrust on him. But underneath it all, he still needs a hug from his dad, and that's what the lighting here is also illustrating. That comfort he still gets from his dad as a kid. The fight scenes have really vivid, unnatural colors, which is a contrast to the more realistic tones of when he's just walking the streets or going about normal day-to-day activities. And that contrast between the unnatural palettes used in the action scenes and the more natural palettes used in more mundane scenes underlines the normalcy of his usual life, how he's just this regular teenager, and how he's been thrown into a really strange and unnatural situation. The animators are really cognizant of staging, shapes, and silhouette at all times, and that's what makes the composition of each shot so strong. There are so many scenes I'd love to do an animation analysis on for various different reasons, but I had to settle for just one for this video or it would just become way too long. So I settled on this one because it's a pretty pivotal moment. Where Miles is at his world, Spider-Man's grave, it's really emotional, and then he meets the other Spider-Man, the Peter Parker from the other world. And this is one of my favorite scenes because it's actually got really great comedic timing. And it's fun after some pretty heavy scenes, so the comedy hits even harder. So I'll start here at this comic panel moment, when Miles pulls aside Peter's jacket to see the Spider-Man emblem. We're in a high angle shot, looking down at Spider-Man from Miles' point of view, and they use this comic book panel device to recap what just happened. So as Miles reveals the emblem, the camera, which has a handheld effect to enhance the feeling of looking through Miles' eyes so it's not a locked off camera, it sort of drifts closer to the Spider-Man symbol as Miles focuses on it, then moves up to Peter's face, and then we cut to Miles looking down at Peter. And this shot is a combo of an over the shoulder from Peter's level and a worm's eye view, because we're looking up at Miles from where Peter is lying. And Miles is centered in the frame, so we can fully see his face as he looks down in shock at Peter, and we still have some of Peter in frame here, so that we have that reference of what Miles is looking down on. It keeps that continuity from the previous shot. The angle here is a Dutch tilt, enhancing Miles' feeling of being a bit discombobulated with finding a Spider-Man who's the same as the Spider-Man he just saw die, but older. And we've got the framing of the background elements and lines in the scene all pointing towards him, so we focus fully on his reaction here. Really nice posing here, shoulders tilted, also echoing that Dutch tilt and avoiding symmetry. Then we see a light start to shine on the two of them. In the next frame, we see his eyes first dart to move towards the source of light in anticipation, and there's a tiny start to the movement of his head. His eyes first dart downwards slightly and his eyelids lower slightly in response to the eye movement, as does his head and the rest of his body. And this subtle movement is slightly offset. And you see that no action is completely isolated in his body, and this is all for organic animation. You'll never really have completely isolated movements in an organic creature, a human or any sort of creature. Then the eye darts to the side more, the head moves up slightly, and what this series of movements does is it gives us a nice natural arc to his head and the rest of the body, although very subtle. And then his eyes settle to the side slightly, and he pauses in a moving hold for a few frames as his brain starts to actually catch up and register what's happening. Because that initial eye and head movement is actually an involuntary response to the stimulus of someone shouting and shining a light on him. But he hasn't actually realized yet that someone is coming. And when he does start to realize, that's when we see the reaction of his eyes widening in fear, and at the same time his pupils shrink with the light hitting them, as well as to enhance that feeling of him getting a fright. As his eyes then dart more to the side to actually look at who is approaching, his pupils squash, and that's a cool example of an unusual use of the principle of squash and stretch there, contrasting the squashed shape with the usual roundness of the pupils to give it a bit more life and flexibility there, and a feeling of the urgency and speed at which he's now looking towards whoever's coming. It's literally just one frame, and it's interesting to note that the sequence is animated on ones, since it's a more fraught and urgent scene. So then we cut to the point of view of the policeman shining their light on Miles, and he looks really small and vulnerable there. really tiny next to this huge building, and in amongst all these gifts and examples of people's love for the previous Spider-Man. He feels like he needs to fulfill this massive legacy as illustrated all around him. He's feeling really overwhelmed. There he is, really small in amongst all these symbols of the public's love for someone whose shoes he's expected to now fill, and Miles is sort of lost in it. So he stands up, looking still really small and vulnerable and alone there in the spotlight. This shot is also establishing the spatial relationship here between Miles and the police. They're quite a distance away from him now, so that also probably plays into the next few decisions that he makes. He starts to raise his hands, and the action is continued in the next cut, which is an over-the-shoulder shot, so we can see what he sees, which is just these intimidating, blinding bright lights, and there's this blue light in the background, and red light shining down on the snow in front of him. Spider-Man's colors, as this is all part of the pivotal moment of him stepping into Spider-Man's shoes. And also because where the cold blue is something unfriendly and intimidating. It's the police who don't sound like they're there to make friends with him. And this huge city he's now expected to protect. It's not a warm and welcoming color. So we cut to a low angle shot and we see Miles still with that follow through on the action of raising his hands. His eyes open wider as he registers the situation he's in, then his eyes dart to the side as he considers his next move and for anticipation as to what he's going to do next. Then they dart back forward to play innocent. Then his eyebrows lower infinitesimally, and we see a very subtle movement of anticipation in his body as he shifts his weight very slightly to his right leg. Then his shoulders start to turn in the direction he's preparing to run. His arms move to give him some momentum to start running. He lifts his left foot and his knee points in the direction he's going to run, and we see that as his body is starting to move and turn to the left, his eyes stay fixed on the police until the last possible moment. So this running that he's doing is almost like an unconscious reaction to what's happening there. We can see that in how his body is reacting first before his eyes even move. So he dips, and that's a really nice arc as he goes. And that's a good clear silhouette here, really nice negative space and good contrast as he runs away. The popos start to come after him, and I really like this comedic moment here where we've got this wide angled shot, and keep in mind the whole time in the previous couple of shots we didn't see Peter Parker in frame, showing that Miles has kind of forgotten about him and the fact that they're still attached. So now with the wide angled shot, both of them are in frame, and we and Miles are reminded that Peter is still a thing as Miles tries to run, and he's going full tilt here. You can see with the extreme slant in his body as he throws his weight forward to gain speed, and he's really bending his knees to get as much power as possible as he pushes off the ground. But unfortunately for him, there's a pesky web still attached to the unconscious guy on the floor. And we see it also clearly from this side view with the clear silhouettes. Miles is brightly lit and really saturated against the dark city background, so nothing in this action is muddy as he runs, and there his foot makes contact with the ground. He's leaning forward, then the web on his chest gets yanked really hard, and his chest goes concave there and then more extreme in the strong C curve, and that motion backwards is contrasted by his arms getting flung out in front of him like that. His feet go out from under him, and with that speed of that motion we have a 2D speed line with some smears, the little puffs of snow here where his feet were pulled so abruptly out of the snow, and then this really nice arc with his feet as well as arcs in the motion of both his arms. And I really love the silhouette here and how both hands are splayed out towards the camera. It's a really strong, graphic, comic book type of pose. Very expressive. And then he turns at the waist and his upper body starts to direct towards the ground as the momentum of his run and the web yanking on his chest pulls his chest around to the direction of the web. There's some really strong follow through here on his arm and wrist and hand as it comes up, and exaggerated stretch here as he starts to fall, and those little 2D speed lines there as an accent. He goes from one very extreme key pose straight into being flat on the ground. And that abruptness of the transition between the two key poses without an in-between gives it some really great comedic timing. It's like your brain is a little surprised at the suddenness between the two extremes. And then the little cherry on top is the web still in the air floating down as it's lighter than him, so obviously takes longer to fall and settle. And then after that, the snow puffing up. He starts to push himself up, and then we cut to the shot from behind him as he turns his body to look at the web. Again, very nice strong arcs, and you've got the 2D elements here. The speed lines as well as the shape here mimicking the shape his hand is making, which is really nice because I feel like that hand shape, the way his fingers are posed here, is just so expressive. It's amazing what you can say with just a hand. Like he's saying, what the fuck is this? What just happened? And the pose is a really strong silhouette. We've got this great negative space between the fingers and around the arm, a nice strong rim light on the side of his body, and framed with the rule of thirds, so we have all the space on screen right, and we're focusing on what he's doing there, realizing he still has the web on him. And then the camera pans to the left to direct our eyes and give more screen space to see Peter's body being yanked up every time Miles pulls on the web, as well as the light from the advancing policeman to give some urgency to the situation. Lots of overlapping action and follow through here on Peter's limp body with his hand getting pulled up and then his wrist and the rest of his body following, and all offset as various parts flop around. The rest of this whole sequence is just madness, and it's hilarious. We've got Miles dragging Peter in the snow like he's a dead body in this bird's eye view shot that gives us a full view of him face planting him in the snow as he fumbles and drops him. Here as they swing away, they make use of smear frames on the snow and chromatic aberration and echoing Peter and Miles as well to get that feeling of speed. And I love this moment of realization hitting Miles as they reach the apex of the swing and he sees that they didn't reach the bridge and are just going to swing back the way they came. We only see his eyes and brows, but it's so expressive. And as they fall and they're silhouetted by the light, we see him wildly grasping for the web. They swing back down towards the policeman, and then we have this really cool shot with the comic background as Peter and Miles swing around each other with all these 2D effects shooting past them. And in the next shot where the camera has a worm's eye view, looking up at where they slam into the wall, this camera angle is showing us how high above the ground they are. And they use some pretty extreme smear frames on Peter there as he flies into the frame, and the speed lines there as he hits, along with some pretty extreme squash. And the same with Miles as he flies in. Extreme smearing and a hectic squash, and they're in some pretty slapstick poses here. I love how they juxtapose the silliness and moments of humor with the seriousness of some of the stuff Miles is dealing with right now. All this genius with the storytelling, balancing it with the emotional beats and the impeccable graphics and animation, all combined to create a really amazing animated work of art. I cannot wait to see Across the Spiderverse, and I'm so glad that I'm alive in the time when the Spiderverse is a thing. I cannot wait to see how it's evolved and the different treatments and animation styles for the other spider people and their worlds. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe if you want to keep up to date with my other videos, and thank you so much to my patrons over on Patreon. As always, your support is hugely appreciated. Thanks for watching. Bye!